The paper is damp. That's the first thing Captain Harold Brennan notices when the stack lands on his folding table. The interrogation forms from 3rd Battalion's cage have been sitting in a canvas bag since 0600, and the Normandy drizzle has turned the mimeograph ink soft at the edges. He peels the top sheet away from the one beneath it, careful not to smear the handwriting. July 1944. A farmhouse 3 miles from the beach serves as the division's intelligence section, and Brennan has been reading German prisoner statements for 11 days straight. This one describes an engagement near Carentan, a Feldwebel from the 919th Grenadier Regiment, captured after his platoon got chewed apart trying to cross an open field. The man's account is routine until the 3rd paragraph. Heavy machine gun fire from multiple positions, the translator has written. Estimate 4 to 6 automatic weapons covering the approach. Brennan reaches for his situation map. 3rd Battalion's after-action report says the field was held by a single rifle squad. 12 men. He checks the grid coordinates twice. Same field. He sets the form aside and picks up the next one. A Gefreiter from the same regiment, different company. Captured 2 hours later, 400 meters to the east. His statement describes concentrated machine gun fire from an American position that pinned his group for 20 minutes before they broke and ran. Brennan already knows what the American report will say. He's seen the pattern before. The position was manned by a squad, 1 Browning automatic rifle. The rest carried M1 Garands. The 3rd form says the same thing. So does the 4th. Brennan lights a cigarette and leans back in his chair. The canvas overhead sags with collected rainwater. Somewhere outside, a truck grinds through mud. He's been doing this work since North Africa, and he knows what a frightened prisoner sounds like on paper. The inflated enemy strength, the obvious attempts to justify surrender. This isn't that. These men are specific. They describe interlocking fields of fire from automatic weapons that did not exist. They report suppression effects that a single BAR shouldn't produce. They're not lying to save face. They believe they were hit by machine gun nests. The American squad that held that field fired M1 Garand rifles, semi-automatic, 8 rounds per clip, 1 trigger pull, 1 shot. The Germans facing them carried carabiner 98K bolt actions, 5 rounds, manually cycled. A trained German rifleman could fire perhaps 15 aim shots per minute. His American counterpart could fire 30, maybe 40 if he didn't care about accuracy. Multiply that across 12 men, and a single American squad could put nearly 500 rounds downrange in 60 seconds. The German squad across from them might manage 150. This is the detail that doesn't appear in the prisoner reports. The Germans describe what they heard and felt. A continuous roar of automatic fire, rounds snapping past faster than they could count. They describe machine guns because that's the only framework they have for what hit them. Their training assumes the enemy rifleman fires at the same rate they do. They have no category for a rifle that shoots as fast as you can pull the trigger. If you've ever wondered what the enemy actually thought when American firepower landed on them, not what the books say, but what they wrote down while their hands were still shaking, drop a comment, hit subscribe. The algorithm buries channels like this unless you tell it not to, and a like takes half a second. Brennan doesn't write a memo about the pattern. He doesn't have to. By the time the hedgerow fighting ends, Every intelligence officer in First Army will have seen the same discrepancy in their own prisoner halls. The Germans keep reporting machine guns that weren't there. The Americans keep holding positions with rifle squads that should have been overwhelmed. The answer isn't complicated. It's sitting in the ammunition pouches of every GI in Normandy. But to understand why that answer mattered, why it broke German expectations so completely that trained soldiers couldn't identify what was killing them, you have to go back to a decision made in Springfield, Massachusetts, 8 years before D-Day. Doberitz, 30 kilometers west of Berlin. The German infantry training grounds sprawl across pine forests and sandy plains where generations of soldiers learn their trade. In 1936, while American ordnance officers in Massachusetts were still arguing about whether a semi-automatic rifle could survive the mud of a real battlefield, German doctrine instructors here were already teaching a revolutionary principle. The rifle is obsolete. Of course, not literally. German recruits still drilled with the carabiner 98K, still learned to shoot, still qualified on the range. But the doctrine manuals made the hierarchy explicit. The German infantry squad existed to serve one weapon. Everything else was support. The MG-34 changed how Germany thought about small unit combat. 900 rounds per minute, belt-fed, bipod or tripod mountable. A single gunner with a trained assistant could produce sustained fire that would have required a full machine gun section in the previous war. By 1942, the improved MG-42 pushed the cyclic rate past 1,200 rounds per minute. So fast, the individual shots blurred into a sound American GEs would later describe as ripping canvas. German squad organization reflected this reality. A standard group consisted of 10 men. One carried the machine gun. One carried the spare barrel and additional belts. The remaining 8 carried rifles and ammunition for the gun. Their primary tactical purpose wasn't to engage the enemy with aimed rifle fire. It was to keep the Maschinengewehr firing, to protect the gunner, to move his ammunition forward, to take over when he fell. I find this fascinating, but can't explain why. The Germans built their entire infantry doctrine around accepting that most of their soldiers were essentially porters. The math made sense. Why train 8 men to fire 15 rounds per minute each when you could train 2 men to fire 1,200? The aggregate firepower wasn't close. One MG-42 produced more rounds per minute than an entire American rifle platoon armed with bolt actions. German tactical manuals were explicit about the relationship. The rifle group fights so that the machine gun can fight, one training document stated. Fire and maneuver meant the gun fired, while the riflemen maneuvered, not to engage, but to position the gun for its next burst. The carabiner 98K was a mature, accurate weapon. It simply wasn't the point. This doctrine worked brilliantly against opponents who fought the same way. The French infantry squad of 1940 centered on the FM-24/29 light machine gun, a capable weapon with a 25-round magazine. The British section carried the Bren, magazine-fed, roughly 500 rounds per minute. Both armies organized their squads similarly, riflemen supporting a central automatic weapon. The Germans just did it better. Their gun fired faster, carried more ammunition, and their doctrine was more ruthlessly committed to the principle. Which brings us back to the problem Captain Brennan noticed in his Normandy farmhouse. When a German squad advanced against a British or French position, they knew what to listen for. The distinctive rhythm of a single automatic weapon marked the enemy's main threat. Suppress that gun, and the position's firepower dropped by 80%. The remaining riflemen, firing bolt actions at the same rate as their German counterparts, posed a manageable threat. German assault tactics were built around this calculation. Find the gun, kill it, roll up what's left. The training that made German infantry so effective in France and Poland, and the early years in Russia, created a perceptual framework. A soldier learns to identify threats by sound. He learns that rapid fire means machine gun, and machine gun means priority target. He learns that rifle fire comes in deliberate spaced shots, one every 4 seconds from a trained man. His survival depends on processing these audio cues correctly under stress. German doctrine never anticipated an enemy that broke the framework, an enemy where the rifles didn't sound like rifles. Every man in the squad producing fire that registered, in the ear of a terrified soldier hugging the dirt, as automatic. No single gun to locate and suppress. The suppression came from everywhere. The Wehrmacht trained its soldiers for a war the Americans refused to fight. What if the problem wasn't the machine gun at all? Springfield Armory sits on a hill above the Connecticut River in Massachusetts, and in the 1920s, it housed some of the most stubborn men in the American defense establishment. The First World War had demonstrated, conclusively everyone agreed, that the machine gun dominated modern infantry combat. The logical response was to give infantry more machine guns, bigger machine guns, lighter machine guns they could actually carry forward. Every major army drew this conclusion. The Germans simply drew it harder than anyone else. Springfield's ordnance designers looked at the same data and asked a different question. The machine gun's advantage wasn't just volume of fire, it was volume of fire from a single point, one weapon, one crew, a single target for enemy suppression. Kill the gunner and the fire stops. What if you could distribute that volume across every man in the squad? Not by giving everyone a machine gun. The ammunition logistics alone made that impossible. But by making the standard rifle fire faster. The idea wasn't new. Semi-automatic rifles had existed since before the First World War. The problem was making one that worked reliably in field conditions, while remaining simple enough for mass production. Hürtgen Garand, a Canadian-born designer working at Springfield, had been tinkering with gas-operated mechanisms since 1919. His early prototypes used a primer-actuated system that the Ordnance Department loved on paper and hated on the range. Fragile, sensitive to ammunition variations. The kind of clever engineering that works perfectly until a private from Iowa gets mud in it. Garand spent most of the 1920s failing. The department kept funding him anyway. Not generously, but enough to keep the project alive through budget cuts that killed a dozen other programs. By 1934, he had abandoned the primer system entirely and rebuilt the rifle around a long-stroke gas piston. Simpler, heavier. The kind of mechanism that could digest dirty ammunition and keep cycling. The rifle that emerged weighed 9.5 pounds empty. It fed from an 8-round en-bloc clip that ejected with a distinctive ping when the last round fired, a sound German soldiers would later learn to listen for, though the tactical value of that knowledge was limited when 8 more rounds could be loaded in under 2 seconds. The gas system bled propellant gases from the barrel to drive the operating rod backward, ejecting the spent case and stripping a fresh round from the clip. One trigger pull, one shot. No manual manipulation required between rounds. The difference showed in the numbers. A bolt-action rifle requires the shooter to break his cheek weld, work the bolt handle up, pull it back, push it forward, lock it down, reacquire his sight picture, and fire. A trained man can do this quickly. He cannot do it instantly. The M1 Garand eliminated every step except pulling the trigger. The theoretical rate of fire jumped from 15 aimed rounds per minute to somewhere between 30 and 50, depending on the shooter and the target. The Ordnance Department understood what this meant. Their reports from the mid-30s discuss distributed firepower and squad-level volume in language that reads almost prophetic now. They weren't trying to replace the machine gun. They were trying to make the distinction between rifleman and automatic weapon less meaningful to the enemy on the receiving end. Adoption wasn't smooth. The rifle cost more than the Springfield 1903 it replaced. It was heavier. It used more ammunition. A logistics concern that would prove justified when American units in combat burned through rifle cartridges at rates that alarmed supply officers. General Douglas MacArthur, then Army Chief of Staff, pushed the program forward anyway. By January 1936, the M1 Garand became the standard service rifle of the United States Army. Germany noticed. German intelligence officers obtained samples and technical data within a year of adoption. The Wehrmacht's ordnance specialists examined the design, tested it, wrote reports. They concluded, correctly, that the Garand was an excellent weapon. They also concluded that it didn't matter. The German infantry squad already produced more firepower than an American squad could match with semi-automatic rifles. The MG-34 fired 900 rounds per minute. 12 Americans with Garands might manage 400. The math still favored concentration. What the German analysts missed wasn't technical, it was tactical. They calculated firepower as aggregate volume. They didn't calculate what it felt like to be on the receiving end when that volume had no center to suppress. The sound hits before understanding does. A crack, then another, then another. So close together they blur into a continuous ripping noise that a German grenadier's training tells him can only come from an automatic weapon. He presses his face into the dirt. Grass stems scratch his cheek. The earth smells like rain and something chemical, cordite maybe, drifting from wherever the Americans are dug in. He cannot see the muzzle flashes. He can only hear what sounds like 4 or 5 machine guns working him over from multiple angles. There is one American squad in front of him, 11 rifles. The M1 Garand's operating rod travels backward approximately 4 inches when the rifle fires. The gas system drives this movement with enough force to extract the spent case, cock the hammer, and strip a fresh round from the clip, all in roughly 1/10 of a second. The shooter's only conscious action is releasing pressure on the trigger and pulling it again. His finger can cycle faster than his brain can process individual shots. A soldier who empties his 8-round clip in combat often cannot tell you how many times he fired. It happened too quickly to count. This mechanical speed created an acoustic signature that German training couldn't decode. A bolt-action rifle produces a distinctive sound pattern. Crack, pause, crack, pause. The pause is the shooter working the bolt. Even fast bolt work creates gaps of half a second or more between shots. A trained ear learns to count these gaps, estimate the number of shooters, identify their positions. German infantry spent years learning to read a battlefield by its sounds. The Garand eliminated the pauses. Crack, 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 crack. 8 rounds in perhaps 2 seconds from a single rifleman. Multiply that across 11 men firing simultaneously, and the individual reports become impossible to separate. The human ear perceives it as sustained automatic fire because that's the only category it fits. There's a detail in the Ordnance Department's 1937 field testing reports that I keep coming back to. The evaluators noted that observers positioned behind the firing line consistently overestimated the number of weapons being fired. They knew they were watching a test. They knew the number of rifles. They still heard more guns than existed. This was happening to trained American ordnance officers watching their own weapon in controlled conditions. The same perceptual error would repeat itself 7 years later across thousands of German soldiers who didn't have the luxury of knowing it was a test. Which brings us back to what the German grenadier couldn't see from his position in the grass. The American squad wasn't firing in volleys. They weren't coordinated. Each man fired when he had a target, reloaded when his clip ejected, and resumed firing when he was ready. The randomness of their individual fire patterns created overlapping waves of sound, a staggered roar without discernible rhythm. The gaps were too short to suggest reloading, and no single point of origin was loud enough to mark a primary weapon. The Browning automatic rifle in the squad actually fired slower than the combined Garand fire around it. The BAR's cyclic rate ran between 300 and 600 rounds per minute, depending on the setting, but it fired in bursts. The Garands fired continuously. A German trying to locate the automatic weapon by sound had no reliable signature to follow. The machine gun was quieter than the rifles. German tactical doctrine had a term for this problem: Feuerkraft, firepower. The manuals calculated it as rounds per minute, aggregated across the squad. By that measure, the German group still won. One MG-42 produced more theoretical firepower than 11 Garands. What the calculation missed was distribution. 11 sources of rapid fire created 11 problems to solve simultaneously. Suppress one, 10 kept shooting, kill half the squad, and the other half continued. There was no node to attack, no gunner whose death would silence the position. The Wehrmacht understood concentrated firepower better than anyone. Concentration was the entire point of their doctrine. The Americans had built a rifle that made concentration irrelevant, not by matching the machine gun's rate, but by making rate of fire impossible to locate. The German grenadier in the grass doesn't know any of this. He knows the sound of machine guns, knows he's pinned. His group leader is dead somewhere behind him. The patrol is already 200 meters past the hedgerow line when the first shots come. Feldwebel Werner Kessler drops into a drainage ditch that stinks of cow manure and stagnant water, his 4 men scattering into whatever cover the Norman countryside offers. The firing has no center. It seems to come from the hedge itself, from every gap in the ancient earthwork barrier, from positions his eyes cannot separate from the tangled roots and summer vegetation. German reconnaissance doctrine in 1944 was precise about this situation. The Aufklärungstrupp, the scouting patrol, had one primary mission when encountering enemy defensive positions: locate the Schwerpunkt, the point of main effort. In practical terms, this meant finding the machine gun. Every Allied defensive scheme the Wehrmacht had encountered for 4 years followed the same logic. The automatic weapon anchored the position. Infantry filled the gaps, find the gun, report its location, and the assault element knew where to focus suppressive fire and where to maneuver. The patrol's job wasn't to fight, it was to identify. Kessler's training told him to listen. The MG produced a distinctive sound, sustained bursts with regular pauses for barrel cooling or belt changes. British Brens had a slower, more deliberate rhythm. American Brownings fell somewhere between. A good scout could identify the weapon type, estimate the range, and pinpoint the azimuth within 30 seconds of first contact. The assault plan built itself around that information. What Kessler heard from the hedgerow didn't fit any category. The fire was too fast for rifles, too distributed for a machine gun. Multiple sources certainly, but without the acoustic gaps that would indicate reloading or repositioning. His brain kept trying to parse it as 3 or 4 automatic weapons firing from overlapping positions, a defensive density that would indicate at least a reinforced platoon. The patrol had been sent to scout what intelligence believed was a single American squad. The reports from these early Bocage engagements share a common confusion. German scouts consistently overestimated American strength by factors of 2 or 3. A squad became a platoon in their reports. A platoon became a company. The error wasn't cowardice or imagination. It was logical inference from the only framework they possessed. X volume of automatic fire equals Y number of automatic weapons equals Z number of supporting infantry. The math was sound. The premise was wrong. Wehrmacht tactical intelligence in Normandy took weeks to correct this systematic overestimation. The first prisoner interrogations produced the answer. American rifle squads carried 8 Garands, 1 Browning automatic rifle, and usually a single Springfield for the squad leader. 11 men, roughly the same numerical strength as a German Gruppe, but German intelligence officers initially dismissed these claims as deception or misunderstanding. The firepower density they were encountering couldn't come from 11 rifles. The prisoners must be wrong about their own organization. They weren't wrong. The American infantry squad in June 1944 could produce sustained fire volumes that German doctrine associated with crew-served weapons. The Garand's 8-round clip emptied in 2 seconds. Reload took another 2. A rifleman who understood his weapon could maintain an effective rate of 20 to 25 aimed rounds per minute indefinitely, limited only by ammunition supply. Multiply across the squad, and 11 men produce something between 200 and 300 rounds per minute, less than a single MG-42 on paper, but distributed across 11 independent firing positions that couldn't be suppressed with a single burst. The Bocage terrain amplified the problem. Norman hedgerows were not hedges in the English garden sense. They were earthen walls 4 to 6 feet high, topped with centuries of root growth from trees and shrubs, often impenetrable to vehicles and opaque to observation. An American squad defending a hedgerow line could spread across 200 meters of frontage, each man firing from a different gap in the vegetation. German scouts trying to locate the automatic weapon found fire coming from everywhere and nowhere. There was no Schwerpunkt because the Americans hadn't built one. Kessler's patrol reported contact with an estimated platoon-strength position, anchored by multiple machine guns. The assault element that attacked that position the following morning expected 40 men and 4 automatic weapons. They found 11 Americans with rifles. The map is stained with coffee rings and pencil erasures. The grid squares over the Hürtgen Forest so marked up that the original contour lines barely show through. Hauptmann Friedrich Lange traces his finger along a defensive sector his regiment has held for 6 days. Stopping at each red circle his intelligence officer has drawn. Suspected machine gun positions, 14 of them, arrayed across a 2-kilometer front that should require a battalion to defend. American strength in this sector is estimated at company plus. The artillery request sitting on Lange's desk asks for 120 rounds of 105 millimeter high explosive, concentrated on the 3 positions his patrols have identified as primary threats. The Division Fire Coordination Center approves the request at 09:15 on November 19, 1944. The guns open fire at 09:42. The shells walk across the forest in overlapping patterns, each impact throwing a column of earth and shattered pine into the gray morning air. The smell reaches the German forward positions within minutes. That particular mixture of explosive residue and burning wood that every soldier in the Hürtgen learned to associate with successful preparatory fires. Lange's assault platoon moves forward at 1000 hours, expecting to find the American machine gun nest destroyed or at least suppressed. They find 3 rifle pits, 9 Americans total, 1 dead from the barrage, 2 wounded, 6 still firing. No machine guns, no automatic weapons of any kind. The BAR that should have anchored this position is 400 meters south, supporting a different squad entirely. The firepower that had pinned Lange's patrols for nearly a week, the sustained volume that his scouts had identified as at least 4 MG positions requiring artillery neutralization, had come from 6 M1 Garands, operated by men who rotated firing duties to conserve ammunition. The after-action report uses language that would become standard across the Hürtgen campaign. Enemy automatic weapons positions that turned out to be rifle teams. Heavy machine gun fire that post-assault inspection revealed as semi-automatic rifle pits. The 275th Infantry Division's records from November 1944 contain 11 separate instances where artillery was requested against identified machine gun positions, and post-battle assessment found only riflemen. The shells weren't wasted in the sense of missing their targets. They hit exactly where the Germans aimed them. The targets simply weren't what the Germans believed them to be. A 3-man rifle team does not require 120 rounds of artillery to neutralize. A machine gun nest does. The Americans had found a way to make their riflemen expensive to kill, not through fortification or armor, but by firing fast enough that German tactical calculus broke down. The Hürtgen Forest was the worst possible terrain for this discovery. The dense pine coverage meant visibility rarely exceeded 50 meters. Sound echoed unpredictably off the trees, making direction finding nearly impossible. A single Garand firing from a covered position produced acoustic signatures that bounced through the forest canopy until the origin point became untraceable. German patrols reported automatic weapons fire from their flanks, from their rear, from positions they had already cleared. The Americans weren't moving that fast. The sound was moving. And because German doctrine interpreted rapid sustained fire as automatic weapons, sound contacts became machine gun reports, which became artillery requests, which consumed shells the Wehrmacht could not replace. The Americans lost men in the Hürtgen. The forest chewed through infantry divisions at rates that shocked even veterans of the Eastern Front. But they lost them as riflemen, valued at rifleman rates. The Germans spent artillery like they were fighting a mechanized force. The exchange rate favored the side with more shells. Germany had fewer shells. By December, 7th Army's artillery ammunition reserves had dropped below 40% of authorized levels. The Hürtgen had consumed rounds faster than the logistical system could replace them, and a meaningful fraction of those rounds had been fired at targets that existed only in the acoustic illusion created by John Garand's 8-round clip. The American infantry fights without a recognizable center of gravity. The phrase appears in a 7th Army intelligence summary dated December 3, 1944, and whoever wrote it understood the problem better than most of his superiors. The document goes on to recommend standard countermeasures, concentrated mortar fire, rapid flanking movements, aggressive close assault, but the opening observation undercuts everything that follows. How do you flank a position with no center? How do you assault a gravity that doesn't exist? German tactical doctrine had answers for every problem except this one. The suppression plan was the first failure point. Standard procedure, when encountering a defensive position, called for identifying the automatic weapons, fixing them with direct fire, and maneuvering against the flanks while the guns were suppressed. The MG-42 gunner couldn't traverse to engage a flanking element if he was ducking incoming fire. Kill him, and the position collapsed. This had worked against Polish positions in 39, French positions in 40, British positions across North Africa and Italy. The machine gun was always the key. Remove it, and riflemen became targets rather than threats. Against American squads, the suppression phase never ended. German machine gunners would pour fire into what they believed was the enemy automatic weapon position, the loudest, most sustained source of incoming rounds. The fire would continue. They'd shift to the next suspected position, still firing. The third, the fourth. Each burst of suppressive fire drew return fire from angles that shouldn't have contained shooters. The flanking element, waiting for the signal that suppression was effective, waited too long. By the time they moved, the Americans had repositioned, and the new flanking route was just another avenue into distributed fire. The ammunition mathematics were brutal. An MG-42 consumed roughly 250 rounds per minute at its sustained rate. Suppressing what appeared to be 4 machine gun positions for the 3 to 5 minutes required for a flanking maneuver meant burning through 3,000 to 4,000 rounds of 792mm ammunition per engagement. German logistics in late 1944 couldn't sustain that expenditure. Each belt of ammunition represented industrial capacity that Allied bombing had already compromised, transportation networks that American fighter bombers interdicted daily, supply lines stretched across a continent the Wehrmacht was steadily losing. The Americans they were suppressing carried perhaps 80 rounds each. The exchange rate was almost comedic. German tactical efficiency, the legendary precision of Wehrmacht combined arms operations, was consuming resources at ratios that would have appalled any quartermaster. The maneuver doctrine that had conquered Europe in weeks was grinding itself to pieces against 11 men with semi-automatic rifles who refused to organize themselves the way enemy infantry was supposed to organize. The Germans weren't being outfought in any conventional sense. They were being bankrupted by their own assumptions. Post-war interviews with German officers show the frustration in different registers. They blamed intelligence failures, terrain, leadership, anything external. A few, the more thoughtful ones, the ones American interrogators found most useful, understood that the problem was structural. Their doctrine had been built to defeat concentrated firepower with maneuver. The Americans had answered by refusing to concentrate. Every German tactical response assumed a center that could be attacked. The Garand had eliminated the center without eliminating the firepower. The flanking maneuver that should have taken 3 minutes took 15 because suppression never achieved its purpose. Artillery preparation that should have neutralized the position missed because the position had no fixed points. The assault that should have overrun scattered riflemen met coordinated fire because those riflemen weren't actually scattered. They just sounded like they were everywhere. And the close assault, when it finally came, found rifle pits instead of machine gun nests. By the time German soldiers understood the difference, they were inside the engagement envelope of 6 or 8 Garands, firing as fast as their operators could pull the trigger. The doctrine trap wasn't ignorance. German tactical thinking was sophisticated, battle-tested, refined across 5 years of continental warfare. The trap was that sophistication itself, a framework so complete, so internally consistent, that it couldn't accommodate an enemy who had simply opted out of the underlying assumptions. The Wehrmacht knew exactly how to fight a machine gun army. The Americans had built something else. December 12, 1944. Somewhere in the basement of a requisitioned schoolhouse near Monschau, a clerk is typing a report that will change nothing. The document is addressed to Army Group B Intelligence Section, and it concerns a systematic analysis of captured American small arms conducted over the preceding 6 weeks. The numbers are precise. Of 417 individual weapons recovered from American casualties and prisoners in the Hürtgen Forest sector, 362 are M1 rifles, 31 are Browning automatic rifles. The remainder splits between carbines, pistols, and a scattering of submachine guns. The ratio works out to roughly 1 automatic weapon per 12 riflemen, exactly what American prisoners had been claiming since June. The report recommends immediate revision of threat assessment protocols. It goes into a filing cabinet. The Ardennes offensive begins 4 days later. We knew, a former intelligence officer told American interrogators in May 1945. By October, we knew the reports were wrong. Every captured position, we counted the weapons, rifles, always rifles. But what could we do? Tell the divisions their doctrine was broken. Tell the artillery they had been wasting shells. The war was lost. Everyone knew the war was lost. Nobody wanted to be the man who wrote the report saying we had been fighting imaginary machine guns. The institutional failure wasn't stupidity. German staff work remained meticulous, even as the Reich collapsed around it. The intelligence sections knew how to count, knew how to compare claimed contacts with recovered equipment. By late autumn, they understood that something fundamental was wrong with the way their forward units interpreted American firepower. The gap between reports and reality was documented, analyzed, and filed. Changing doctrine required admitting error. Admitting error required someone willing to tell generals that their battle-tested tactical framework had a hole in it large enough to drive American rifle squads through. The Wehrmacht in December 1944 had no shortage of problems. Adding, "We don't understand how Americans fight to the list," served no purpose anyone could articulate. So the reports kept coming. Machine gun positions identified, artillery requested, shells expended, and in the American rifle pits that absorbed those shells, men with 8-round clips kept firing at rates their enemies couldn't explain. The Ardennes offensive put the question to rest through sheer operational momentum. There was no time for doctrinal revision when panzer divisions were driving for the Meuse. The intelligence summary from December 12th sat in its cabinet while the Battle of the Bulge raged overhead, its careful analysis of captured weapons as relevant as a peacetime training manual. German infantry in the Ardennes made the same errors they had made in Normandy, in the Hürtgen, in every engagement since June. They reported machine guns where rifles existed and requested suppressive fire against positions that had no center to suppress. Men died in flanking maneuvers against enemies who weren't where doctrine said they should be. The Americans they faced were often exhausted, undersupplied, sometimes cut off entirely from their supporting units. The defense of places like Bastogne became legendary precisely because the defenders held with so little. What the legends rarely mention is that so little included rifles that fired as fast as men could pull triggers, rifles that made 11 soldiers sound like 40, that drew German tactical responses calibrated for threats 3 times their actual size. The offensive failed in January. The Rhine crossings were being planned by February. Come April, the Wehrmacht existed only in pockets of resistance that American and Soviet forces were systematically eliminating. The intelligence report from December 12th was captured along with everything else: the filing cabinets, the typewriters, the carbon copies, the requisitioned schoolhouse itself. An American translator read it, noted its conclusions, and passed it along to the historical section for archiving. The Germans had figured it out. The documentation proves that much. Somewhere between the rifle pits and the filing cabinets, between the men who died and the men who counted the weapons afterward, the truth had emerged clearly enough to put on paper. 1 automatic weapon per 12 riflemen. The rest were Garands. The report changed nothing, because by the time anyone read it, there was nothing left to change. Oberndorf am Neckar, 1959. The Heckler and Koch factory sits in the same valley where Mauser once built rifles for the Kaiser, and the engineers walking its production floor are testing prototypes of a weapon called the G3. The new West German Army needs a standard infantry rifle, and the specifications read like a confession, written in technical language. Semi-automatic operation. 20-round detachable magazine. Effective aimed fire at ranges exceeding 400 meters. The Bundeswehr's procurement documents never mention the Hürtgen Forest, never reference the intelligence reports from December 1944, never acknowledge that German soldiers spent the last year of the war fighting phantoms created by American rifle design. They don't have to. The specifications speak for themselves. 14 years after the Wehrmacht collapsed, Germany was building an army equipped to fight the way Americans had fought. NATO standardization pushed the same direction across the alliance. The Belgian FN-FAL, the American M-14, the British L-1A1, the Italian BM-59. Every major Western power adopted semi-automatic battle rifles in the decade following the war, weapons that put sustained individual firepower in the hands of every rifleman rather than concentrating it in crew-served guns. The machine gun didn't disappear. It remained the squad's base of fire, the suppression tool, the volume generator. But the ratio shifted. By 1960, a NATO infantry squad looked more like the American squads of 1944 than the German squads they had fought. The lesson of the last war, a British Army training document from 1957 noted, is that rifle fire can achieve effects previously associated only with automatic weapons, provided the rifle is capable of rapid semi-automatic operation. Whether anyone consciously drew that lesson is harder to establish. The archives don't contain a memo saying, "The Americans were right about distributed firepower." The procurement decisions unfolded through committees and technical evaluations and budget negotiations, each step justified on its own terms. The G3 was adopted because it was reliable and accurate, and because it could be manufactured domestically. The FNFAL spread across NATO because Belgium needed export revenue, and the design worked. The M14 replaced the Garand because the Army wanted a single weapon to replace 4 different small arms. Nobody stood up in a conference room and said, "German soldiers couldn't tell the difference between a rifle squad and a machine gun platoon, and that's why we're doing this." The men who could have explained it were mostly dead or scattered. John Garand retired from Springfield Armory in 1953 after 44 years of government service. He received a medal and a pension and spent his remaining years in Springfield, Massachusetts, occasionally corresponding with collectors and historians who wanted to understand the weapon that bore his name. "I tried to make a good rifle," he told one interviewer in 1961. Whether it was good enough, the soldiers decided that. He died in 1974. The obituaries mentioned his patent, his career, his contribution to American victory. None of them mentioned the German intelligence reports, the artillery shells expended against phantom machine guns, the doctrine that broke itself against his 8-round clip. The rifle pits are gone now, of course. The Hürtgen Forest regrew over the shell craters and foxholes. The German farmers replanted their fields. The hedgerows of Normandy returned to their agricultural purposes. What survives sits in museums and private collections. Garands with their stocks worn smooth by hands that carried them across France and into Germany, their operating rods still cycling with the mechanical precision that made them feel like automatic weapons to men who had never seen anything like them. There's one in the Springfield Armory, National Historic Site, serial number 2,347,000 and change, manufactured in 1943. The museum card beside it lists the technical specifications, caliber, weight, rate of fire. What the card doesn't mention, the rate of fire was the point. American industrial philosophy and German tactical doctrine collided in the hedgerows and forests of Western Europe, and that collision produced a sound the Wehrmacht couldn't interpret correctly. Men died because of that sound. German soldiers who advanced into what they thought were suppressed positions. American soldiers who held those positions with nothing but rifles and ammunition and the mechanical advantage of a gas-operated action. The rifle just sits there, behind glass, looking like any other piece of old military hardware.